But today we're going to talk about how we got from the Gato class in beginning of World War II to the Thresher, in 1961. Okay, this is a neat picture of three submarines moored in Subic Bay. Those who have been there, this is the inside anchorage typhoon hold. You've got a Darter, made in the 50s, but still a diesel boat. You got a skate class boat over here. I served on one of those as a junior officer. And then what do we got here? We got a Thresher class. Can anyone tell me why the Thresher class submarine is so lower in the water than these big guys? Sure. No. Norman, you know this answer. Reserve buoyancy, absolutely, and superstructure. These are all filled with superstructure, and the Thresher class is not. So we're going to talk about how we got here. Okay, I have to have a disclaimer because I know this stuff, and so I have to tell the Navy that I get my information from Norman. And as you notice, I addressed Norman because he helped me with this brief a couple of years ago. Submarines below 800 feet is classified. Well, Norman Friedman has a wonderful book, Submarines After 1945. He did a whole case, but actually declassified the Thresher class could go 1,300 feet, and they reclassified it about 9 years later. And so every time the Navy asked me, I just reference Norman Friedman, Dr. Friedman. He says it. Okay, how we got from here? Here's a Gato. There's Thresher. And we had a lot of reasons why we got from there to there. Let's take a look at what we did. We got submerged speed from 9 knots, 28 knots, 29 knots. We got, from 1 hour at 9 knots submerged to limitless, and we went very deep. And there's a lot of reasons why we went very deep, and that was actually the death of Thresher. We got great sonars, and we had these noisy nuclear submarines, and we quieted them by 1961. Older submarines had 2 screws, because submarines and ships always have 2 screws. I guess we just kept that tradition up. And they have the stern planes and the rudder behind the screws. So the wash of the screws gives you good depth control and maneuvering control at slow speed. They had to have bow planes for depth control. They had to rig them out. They had sonars. And our sonars, talk about German sonars a little bit, but here we have a classic setup on World War II submarines. You got a passive sonar here. It's rotated manually. If you go to the bowfin in Pearl Harbor, they get the setup. It's beautiful. The guy rotated around and get a relative bearing. When he gets the loudest noise, he gives that to the conning tower. Then you have an active passive sonar, this ball over here, that's lowered from the bottom of the submarine up to the ballast tanks. And they actually use it. If you read about Flucky and those guys, their final range on the surface was to use that active range on that sonar. And both trained manually. Radar. Modern radar on submarines is just for contact avoidance and for navigation. World War II, not so. Very important. First thing, everyone knew that airplanes were bad for submarines, right? So if you have put this whip antenna all the way up, you can get a good range to an aircraft approaching. You can't get an exact bearing, but you can get a range that could tell you to submerge the submarine rapidly. There's a surface search for radar, which of course you get bearing and range, which gives you a target course. And so if you get a visual bearing and a radar range, you lock the guy in. And you can submerge the submarine to a radar depth in which about right here, and so you could lower your silhouette and still use radar. Okay, Rear Admiral Withers took over the Scouting Force Pacific Fleet in the summer of '41. Okay, the Scouting Force was maritime patrol aircraft, long range, and submarines. And he was reading what was happening in the North Atlantic in 1940 and 41. Aircraft were when they could find the submarines, they're eating them alive. So he said we need to dive deeper. submarines weren't diving deeper back in those days. 100 foot, they didn't want to go below 100 feet because, they didn't like water coming in. Think about submariners, water coming into the people tank.
Yeah.
So, so he told them, okay, guys, you're gonna, on your first dive, and every dive, you're gonna dive to 100 feet. And you're gonna go to your maximum depth, which is 250 feet, every time, you're out. And he was worried about the aircraft spotting the submarine submerged, so he gave his maritime patrol guys cherry bombs. And aviators just love picking on submarines. So if they were ordered, if they saw a submarine in the submerged submarine, they could drop cherry bombs on it, let it know that it was too shallow and that it was vulnerable. Okay, Gato was the lead ship of the class. It was they developed the submarines pretty good. They got the diesel engines right. And so they said, let's go to serial production on this class of submarine because it's pretty good. And the engineering duty officer said, we're reading too what's happening up in the Atlantic. And it looks like depth charges, you get a little bit deeper, you're going to be good. So they did a review of all the piping systems, the hulls, and said, we can add 50 more feet. And so they did it. This was engineering duty officers. This was not requested by the line officer, just engineering duty officers being smart. Okay, this is how Gato would have looked coming out of the shipyards. It's got a nice little control room up here, a little place where you can get down in bad ways, look through windows, portholes. So as the waves come over, everyone been on the submarine and heavy seas, deep water. Yeah. So this is protected. And you've also got nice fairing for underwater speed. Well, that didn't work very well. And why did it not work very well? So here's your silhouette of your Gato. And this is a silhouette how it went to war. This is how it came into Pearl Harbor. Remember, these submarines were torpedo boats. They were not real submarines. They could go hide for a little bit of time submerged, but they were really made for surface action. And so why did they do this? Why did they remove it? Why did they remove all that structure? Go ahead, over here.
Faster diving.
Nope.
Sound.
Because in the Imperial Japanese Navy, yesterday somebody said it, they had excellent lookouts. And they would, and remember this is a torpedo boat, so they're not worried about underwater speed. They're worried about the Japanese lookouts spotting them as they were closing in for the kill. Okay, let's talk a little about propulsion. You've got 2 batteries on a diesel boat. You can't run the diesel submerged. All the air goes away, everybody dies. Not good. So what you got 4 diesels hooked to generators. It just happens to be all the trains companies in the United States were shifting over from coal to diesel electric train engines. And so these worked well, because they were being developed the Navy kind of sucked off what the trains were doing. And that's why you see 4, but it would probably been more efficient to have 2 big diesels, but these work great. Electric drive, electric propulsion motors, and some have direct drive. Your S boats could actually do a direct drive through a number of clutches. But so you had the battery for submerged operation, diesels to charge the battery, and you had surface beyond the surface. Didn't have snorkels. Okay, you have a conning tower. Okay, this is a better picture of the bridge. A lot of guys died in World War II because of this bridge setup, because the waves would knock them over, injured, and you hear the stories about a lot of the injuries up here. But they had a conning tower right below it. The conning tower is a watertight compartment, so you can step from the bridge, open the hatch, jump down into the conning tower, shut the hatch, dive the submarine very quickly. They dove the submarine from the surface. On the second blast of the diving alarm, you opened the main ballast tank vents and you went down. You had to be down. All the lookouts had to get down. Everybody had to get down quickly. The control room was down below another hatch. So if the conning tower flooded, after the conning tower flooded, you had a tank, the safety tank you could blow and compensate for the conning tower being flooded. And then we went to a bridge, a sail, free flood, except for a bridge access hatch. Nice picture here, looking up through the hatches. I've seen that many a time, going up and down, up to the bridge. And we got rid of the conning tower. Everything moved down to the control room. Okay, we stopped building the Cato class because the follow-on classes could go deeper. You look at it, and they're all about the same. 9 knots. If you went 9 knots submerged, you got 1 hour. Then you're on the surface. You're dead in the water. So you couldn't go very fast, very long on a submerged submarine. They have the same number of tubes, but they got deeper. The Balo and Tench class were deeper. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But they increased the maximum operating depth. It became very important. Okay, depth charge. It's all about depth charges. Depth charge creates 2 different kinds of shocks. It has a shock damage, which hits the submarine immediately. But if that depth charge gets below you, it creates a bubble pulse that's pulsing back and forth that can migrate to the hull. And it can stick to the hull for a couple of cycles. And that's shaking the submarine. And that get enough momentum, you can knock heavy machinery off its foundations. That's no good. That's no bueno. So bubble pulse is only good at short range. So what you really want to do is you want to get the submarine deeper than depth charges. Okay, you got low submergence speed and not much endurance. So they would dive, go to head full, dive in the battery, turn, and then they got to slow because they can't keep that up for very long. They got to conserve that. When they could hear the depth charge drop, get a bearing to it, they could go to maximum speed just for a few seconds or to turn away, and they got to slow again. And 9 knots is not enough to fight the submarine submerged. But you basically had to run in front of the convoy and be prepared because you can't maneuver very fast. Okay, this is how the Balo and Trench classes got deeper. Again, engineering duty officer said, you know, we have a lot of lead. During the 1930s, they started building submarines lighter. That means they had to add more lead. Why do you have lead in a submarine? Ballast. But if you want to add heavier equipment, then you can remove lead and keep the submarine so it'll be neutrally buoyant. But lead's expensive, and you need it for bullets. World War II, you need it for bullets. So the engineering duty officers on their own said, why don't we just make the hull thicker? And why don't we add a different kind of steel? Why don't we do an alloyed steel to make it? So you can see that it increased the hull plane in weight, removed the lead, everyone's happy. And after World War II, all the submarines were being built with high tensile steel. Standard test depth was 700 feet. And then finally, HY80, high yield steel, 80,000 PSI, allowed them to build the pressure hull with the thresher, which increased the test depth to 1,300 feet. You see, the mindset is all about thresher. It's from World War II. Depth charge is bad, deep, good. Okay, take a look at what a depth charge. A depth charge is really an inefficient weapon. You know, look how close you had to be in order to really kill a submarine. And also, if you get that depth charge below you, the charge is going to go up because of ocean pressure. So that blast is going to move that submarine up. You don't want to be on the surface with a bunch of Japanese happy gunners, right? That's not good either. So the idea is you need to get underneath the depth charges, and you need to increase the depth. So that's the reason for the increase of the depth of the Balo submarine. Look at this. It's the most common Japanese depth charge. If you're a deep diving submarine and not in the South Pacific where the water is really shallow, if you can get to 600 feet, you're impervious from Japanese depth charges. So that was another factor you can see. A lot of other reasons for being deeper, as your sonar, more water between you and that sonar on the surface ship. As a surface ship comes in, can only ping down to a certain angle. And so a deeper submarine, you're going to lose the submarine on your last bit, and that gives you more time to maneuver away. Your bubble pulse diameter is smaller. So there's a lot of good reasons for going deep in World War II. Take a look at the Germans. The Germans, this type of U-boat was their most successful. 568 made. A lot of them were lost too. It's a small submarine. Then again, this submarine is not going across the Pacific like our submarines. It's going out to the mid-Atlantic to meet the conflict. It's a little bit slower on the surface, deeper diving, and it doesn't have a conning tower. Germans were always ahead. And this is what it do. This is what our submarines did to Japanese and what German submarines did to the Allied convoys. The convoys were fairly slow. So if you're a 20-knot submarine, you can catch up to those convoys and you can run around in them. And using stealth, the Germans would also ballast down, vent the ballast tanks a little bit to keep their decks awash and make them even smaller. So this is the Allies trying to shoot up flares so they can see the submarines, because there's a bunch of confusion. Once torpedoes stop going off, it all gets to be kind of crazy. Now things were not going so well for the Germans. Radar, especially on long-range patrol aircraft, could spot the German submarines on the surface. And we had HF Huffduff direction finding. The German submarines were talking back and forth to coordinate their wolf pack attacks. We could coordinate where they were, run out and get them, or at least put them down, submerge them. So the Germans came up with a solution: the electric boot, the first real submarine. Now Jim Hornfischer and I, when he was writing his last book, had an argument about this. He claims the Nautilus was the first real submarine. I said no, it's a German Type 21, because it was designed to be submerged. Look at no deck guns, no rails. It's got two anti-aircraft guns that are fired into the hull. It can go fast. It's designed to run into that 9-knot convoy and shoot the torpedoes, and then reload use the hydraulic rams to reload the torpedoes and shoot again, and then be able to run away and get away from the destroyers so that it would be safe. And it was designed to leave port, go to the dive point, and then submerge. And then when it had to go back into port, come back into where it was too shallow and surface. It was a true submarine. And this was the key, the snorkel. They actually had snorkels before World War II, but submarines could dive so quick they didn't need them, right? You see the aircraft coming, dive in 30 seconds, and you're all good. Radar absorbent material. You've got a radar detector sitting right up here on top of the star. 2 pipes. One pipe brings in fresh air for the people in the diesels. One pipe exhausts the diesel engine, so you don't exhaust directly to sea, you get more horsepower, right? So it was designed to, once it got out on patrol, it would be submerged. And sonars, we talked to someone yesterday about this was the Germans had better sonars than us. You saw our manually trained sonars. The Germans always had sonars fixed in the hull and get bearings. This was the best. It was the first circular array sonar. The Prince Eugen, if I pronounced that right, the cruiser that escorted Bismarck, had one of these on board. It detected the Hood and the Prince of Wales long before they had visual, passively. The Japanese tried to play. The Germans gave the Japanese their balcony sonar, and they came up with this class. Notice you've got the screw here like a modern submarine, screw aft of the stern planes and the rudder. A big problem was that they moved the bow planes underwater out here, and so there was fixed, so that made it real hard trying to moor. If you moored next to a ship, you had to be careful not to ram into the ship and put a hole in it. The major problem was they had, in order to get the speed up here, 19 knots submerged, they had batteries everywhere. Every free space had batteries, and they weren't very well stowed. They weren't very well racked. And so, in fact, we're trying to bring one of these submarines back from Japan. They got into rough weather, And they asked, what does the manual say? The manual says submerge, but they're ordered not to submerge, so they had to go hold the battery stacks up. At the end of, picture here is Tommy's British soldiers capturing a shipyard with German Type 21s. So all the big players got Type 21s. Everyone knew this was a great submarine, and they wanted it. The Soviets made two versions. The Whiskey here is a smaller version. You see they have their version of the balcony sonar. But of course, the Germans made things very old, like their tanks, overly complex, overly engineered, too hard to make. So, and the Russians, well, we all know what the Russians' equipment is like. It's got to be really simple. The difference between sailor-proof and Russian sailor-proof is a big thing. So they made these things very simple. And I used to be worried about that Foxtrot. Sit over here. I toured that about 10 years ago, and I went, wow, I was afraid of this. Okay. They also made a Zulu, which is about the size of the Type 221, big submarine. And our version was a tank class. Now, we called our version of the balcony the BQR2. I've been a shipmate with the BQR2. It is not great, especially if you're looking at other submarines. But it could go fast, but it could not go fast very long underwater. Endurance was a problem. And it had other problems too. Everybody knows about the pancake diesels. They had to increase the length of the submarine to put in conventional diesels and all that kind of fun stuff. But we had all these great submarines, Balo and Tench class, who were fairly deep diving. And so we did the Guppy program, greater underwater propulsion, and we added the BQR2 Bravo, the German sonar, and we added the snorkel, bigger batteries, and got rid of all the stuff, all the things that were slowing it down. Then we come to the Nautilus. Now we solved the endurance problem. But with the endurance problem, you got a submarine that's very noisy. But back in the 50s, the sonars, the submarine could go so fast that destroyers couldn't keep up with it. It couldn't track it. So even though it's like a freight train coming, diesel boats could hear this, but they couldn't get in position to attack it because it was going so fast. And again, we've kept the same look as the diesel submarine. Why did we do that? It's because designers, admirals say, well, we did this the way we've done it, right? So we'll just keep these nice flat with wooden decks. It's nice on cedar. It's a pain as weapons also trying to get that stuff cleaned off. Then we have nuclear power. Does anyone know? He's around for a long time. Anyone know what KOG means? Kindly old gentleman. He wasn't very kindly, but he was old. But he did wonderful things. He does wonderful things. We'll run through a nuclear repulsion plant. Don't bore you too much. We have the hot rock, the reactor core, right? Makes heat with fission. We get a pressurized coolant, a closed loop, using basically a steam kettle up here to keep it pressurized. Main coolant pumps pump the coolant around, pick up heat from the core, pass to the steam generators, creates steam, goes through the steam stops, drives turbine generators and motors. The turbine motor goes through reduction gear. You got a clutch, very important. If your reactor craps out on you, then you've got a battery and you've got a diesel engine. You unclutch the clutch and go home about 5 knots back to your port. The steam, of course, steam cycle is recaptured and pumped back around to the steam generators. This required no air. It allowed for unlimited endurance. That was a good thing. Then we have the skate class. Well, they were building the skate class kind of at the same time that they were trying to build the Nautilus and Seawolf. So they just, what's a good design? Well, everyone likes the Tang so much. We'll just make this a Tang class, put in a reactor in the front, and we'll add some of the Nautilus type features to it. They really didn't have any studies or any experience with Nautilus to build these class. They were building it again. We're dealing with a 1945 sonar. Well, somebody got smart and said, we really need an experimental submarine. We need an experiment to know how the best way to design and make these. So they commissioned Albacore, no torpedo tubes. But It had all the right stuff. It did a lot of good stuff. It certified the teardrop shaped hull that you want to put the screw and the at the very end of the submarine, which means you're not very good at slow speed maneuvering, but it's much quieter, much more efficient. And they did all kinds. Look, they have an X-ray. The Russians have had that for years. Across rudder and stern planes, and we're just now going to do that in the Columbia. How many years later? So, but they proved it back in the early '50s that was a good setup. Other fun things too. They had two screws, all kinds of configurations. So that developed into the skipjack class. Skipjack was a great submarine, but you still got a 1945 sonar, essentially with some better tubes and stuff on it. And you need to decrease the wetted surface, so you want to decrease the diameter, and so you neck in the ballast tanks. I'll show you a better picture of that later. Well, skipjack was great. It was fast, but it was a bad sonar platform. It was noisy, just like nothing was sound mounted. It was very noisy, and so it was not. Our major threat was what? The Soviet submarine force, right? And they were just putting to sea their first nuclear submarines in about 1958. Huge sail. It was great electronic, all kinds of nice mass. You could suck up all the Soviet, emissions from that, but not good for submarines. So they really started stretching hard. We got to get quiet. We got to get quiet. And they built the Tullabee. Well, the Tullabee was turbo electric. Working around with the electric propulsion submarine for a long time. Well, it was very quiet. It had the torpedo room was moved from the bow back to the middle of the ship. Torpedo tubes coming up the side, and it was a great sonar platform. But my heavens, it was slower than the skate class. It was slower than Tang, 14 knots. You couldn't go very anything, and it was small. Which means that you can't carry a lot of torpedoes. You can't carry stuff. It was a one of a kind, and they realized it. But it was a good try. Then we have Thresher. Thresher became bigger. It was a improved skipjack class, what it was called. It was really its own class. But we did that game throughout the 70s and 80s. Every 637 was built was different than the one before it. So. Here you torpedo tube doors here in the center of the ship. They reduced the size of the sail. They wanted to keep the speed up, and the way to do that, they even polished the welds up here to make the submarine to reduce the appendage drag. By making the sail smaller, which meant you got really wet if you're up here on the sail in the 594 class submarine on the surface. At flank speed, I could reach down and touch the water coming over the fairwater. But it only lost about a knot of speed. And you see the torpedo room moves back here. You got a nice big spherical sonar in the bow. This next will show you, this is the ballast tank arrangements of a Gato. The ballast tanks go all the way out to the hull, which had to increase the size of the hull. They were worried about reserve buoyancy. World War II submarines were designed to flood one compartment, right? The norm, yeah. And so they had all these ballast tanks, but they increased the diameter of the submarine. Again, this shows you that ballast tanks were blue. They were faired into the hull. They lost a lot of reserve buoyancy, but Soviet weapons were really big, and so it really weren't talking about taking on a weapon to survive it. But you got the increased speed, and that was the important thing. We show some variable ballast tanks there too. So these are the summary of the major improvements we got with Thresher. We got sound quiet. The whole bow compartment, which is now a berthing area, inherently quiet. They sheathed it in aluminum with fiberglass, make it even quieter. You got a conformal array up here and a spherical array, and you got in a quiet compartment. You have the first computer fire control system, and that's because of Subrock. We'll talk about Subrock here in a second. You had a lithium bromide air conditioning unit. Everybody makes a lithium bromide. It uses steam to remove heat from your chill water system. And at the time, we had R12 rock crushers, piston-driven air conditioning units that sounded like rock crushers. So if you could, that made it quiet. And everything is sound mounted. Even the decks are rafted. The engineering, the propulsion turbine and the turbine generators were on a raft, a sound mounted raft, so that you wouldn't transmit noise to the hull. Using these kind of things. Of course, the sound mounts on the propulsion raft are a lot bigger. Gives you an idea. I took this from Norman's book. Thank you, Norman. Took a picture of it. I'd probably get in trouble with that. Couldn't find a good picture of it. But it's all the holes would be transducers. So you got the whole look at the whole spectrum, which was really improved in sonar. You can see the conformal array. And we have this wonderful sonar. And why we need a big, wonderful sonar? Because we want to be able to project a nuclear depth charge, whether it be a ballistic missile shot out of a torpedo tube at 25 nautical miles. It kind of didn't work, but it was a nice idea. Well, the contractors always say this sonar is going to be able to work at 50 miles. We don't know that. But 25 nautical miles, and you've got a tritium boosted weapon. I was a weapons officer on one of these things. You're talking over 100 kilotons if you got a tritium boost. And you'd hope that what's that?
That's one hell of a depth charge.
One hell of a depth charge, yes. Yes. And you have so you're not dealing with feet, you're dealing with probably hundreds of yards or a half a mile or whatever. Certainly soft kill a couple of miles. Soviet ship. The deeper advantages of pressure, again, like World War II, you put more water between you and the sonar. You hope that you get some thermal layers in there. It takes longer for depth charges and torpedoes to get to you. Now, if you get a torpedo that exhausts to the ocean, what happens when it has to go dive well deep? It's going to run out of fuel, so because it's got to have the back pressure of the ocean, right? And one of the most important operational reasons is because you got a fast submarine, you got a control surface jam in a rise or dive position like the stern planes. You're going to go up or down very rapidly before you can stop the submarine. But if you've got a deeper depth, then your chance of exceeding that, broaching the surface, which of course is a safety issue, or going down below test depth, is get you in trouble with less chances of doing that. The trouble is that as part of my lecture on Thresher, what got Thresher was the failure to realize the inherent dangers of almost doubling the test depth from 700 feet to 1,300 feet. They didn't plan for it. They didn't have procedures for it. They didn't make the equipment for it. A lot of stories. And of course, that world's most advanced submarine sank in April of 1963. 60th anniversary will be this April. Questions? Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about the CO and the sodium, liquid sodium? Was liquid sodium reactor?
Yes.
Yeah. How did that come about, and what did we find from that? And talk a little bit about that.
I mean, everyone looks at, you get a pressurized water reactor. You got to keep the core pressurized, and sodium you don't need that. Sodium, all you need is a thin wall vessel. You just got to keep it hot. And the trouble is you've got sodium and you've got water, and water. Everybody knows what happens in high school when the prof throws a little chunk of sodium into water, right? It's not good. It's not good. And so they thought they had it set with there were going to be no leaks, but there were leaks, and so they changed it out to essentially a Nautilus-like plant. The Soviets tried this on the Akula, and it's just very hard with the liquid metal and keeping it in where it was. And the Kula, they had problems with that because if you didn't keep it heated, it'd freeze up on you, right? So they had problems with, having an electrical problem and having all the coolant become solid. Yeah. So
Was the nuclear system on the Thresher also improved over, the escape, the tank, et cetera? Was the same?
no, it's SIW reactor plant, which was a more powerful, easier to operate, easier to maintain. I qualified engineer on the S3W plant, and it was just not as good as S5W. So it was a much better plant, and that was on skipjack, and just again just moved up to Thresher. Yes.
At what point was crush depth, like ever planned and designed for the submarine?
Okay, submarine is built. I didn't go into that because I got in trouble last year. I didn't have any time for questions. I cut some of the stuff out. Germans have a two safety factor. So if it's designed for 600 feet, maximum depth, you can go to 1,200 feet. So US is 1.5. So it's 1,950 feet was collapse depth. Theoretically, you can take a submarine down to collapse depth and you won't get any damage. But they say that there's a naval instruction on that, and it said you don't really want to do that because we really don't have the calculation technique to know what's going to happen to that pressure hull after it gets worked a couple of times. And so Thresher collapsed at 2,400 feet. If you want to go look at the December 21 submarine review, we do an analysis of that. And although we don't have a good bubble pulse on Thresher to actually calculate like we do on Scorpion, but it collapsed over 400 feet below its calculated collapse depth, which is what the engineers want.
More a comment than a question. I work in the chemical industry, high pressure reactors. And there the limitation is not the rupture pressure depth of your case. It's the number of cycles you get. The time you cycle it,
Yes.
fast you cycle it, injures the steel of it.
Yes.
So you have to keep track of how many times it cycles. When it reaches a cycle limit, it's scrapped.
So what the instruction said that if you went below your test depth, your operating depth, then you're working the submarine harder, and they can't really calculate. I don't. Probably today they
can calculate.
Probably today they can calculate it, but back in my day, but you can do that. It says the instruction said specifically you can go below your test depth. I knew one squadron commander that told his officers that they had to escape from the Russians. You need to go deeper. Do it.
The new chemical reactor, pressure vessel reactors we work with, sensors built on the hull. Computers monitor it, and they keep an exact record of all the stresses. They're legal to operate outside of conserve, at least in the US.
Yes, there's also a submarine that went below its test depth.
Yeah.
That was the
Naval.
green thing. Its digital gut gauge stuck, and it continued to operate. Yes.
When did we go from having a separate conning tower outside the hull to control?
That happened in the 50s. Triton was the last submarine built with a conning tower.
Any question, did they ever consider putting a torpedo on the end of the sub rock like we basically did for the gas rock?
Well, it was ballistic trajectory, and it would come down very hard. In fact, one of the things you did to make it ready is put a shock mitigating warhead on it. Norm?
The answer is yes, they did. With a Mark 46 or 44. I think that they died because no one believed you'd get close enough. The British took very seriously at the 44s, 46s, and they figured out that the chance of actually was hitting it was you get errors. But yeah, we got interested in that. And it's a nice idea. And if the homing torpedo is hot enough,
bridge, you know, on the surface.
Well, this thing was, aerodynamic vehicle. And I think, there might be an idea that the escorts would get together. And even if you didn't have the thing on board, you could help the record. Now, how could this somewhat really well? That's for sure. I think that their grants, their agency is, quite well. That was our part.
Well, it was also that ballistic missile went down from its trajectory and hit the water very hard. So you have to have a very tough torpedo to survive that. Because most of your torpedoes in ASROC are parachute retarded, right?
Right, the ASROC.
ASROC was parachute retarded. ASROC was 10,000 maritime. Subrock was 25 miles.
Yeah, I always thought when I was a subject officer cruiser, if I had fire and ASROC depth charge, I'll put myself out of the AW business.
Yes.
But my question is, personnel, as these classes succeeded one another, was there a point in which the personnel situation, selection procedure took sort of a jump? Or it became harder, significantly harder to find?
Yes, there's a big problem with personnel, and that's an hour-long talk about the battle during the Thresher testimony that they got Chief of Naval Personnel and about the lack of officers. The officer experience level was terrible. I mean, they had 4 officers on board that just reported on board. They could barely do port and starboard watches during Thresher sea trials. But that was Rickover control. Rickover did not want a guy like Lucky Flucky on the bar operating his reactors. He's the guy that put the shore party ashore, blew up the train, blew all the rules away. They did not want somebody who was going to violate the rules on operating the reactor. They were always taught, drive the submarine like you're a naval officer, reactor is Rickover's.
The other point was Rickover refused to accept NESEP graduates, many of whom were brilliant young guys. And they could be AWES, but he wouldn't let them.
But he didn't accept guys in World War who had courage medals from World War II. They had the academic requirements, and they were COs, XOs of diesel boats, very successful. He wouldn't accept them either, because the guys like Lucky Flucky got medals of honor for doing what? Breaking all the rules and being lucky. Yeah, but he didn't want that. He did not want that with officers doing his reactors.
Question, but would you say that anti-submarine warfare, how would you say anti-submarine warfare has been able to keep up with the changing submarine technology? Has it been doing?
I don't know anything about modern submarine technology. I lost my clearance in '94. I have no idea.
From World War II until
Yeah.
Want me to go away?
No.
Okay.
Person with Paul Kennedy, you've got.
Okay.
We'll let you
Yep.
for.
So on a lighter note, do you have any good anecdotes from your Rickover interview? Were you shoved in a closet or forced to sing a song?
Oh yeah, yes, but the thing was, he really liked me because my grades in Standing Naval Academy had improved, and most guys don't because they got girlfriends and stuff, and you torture them on that. I was an oceanographer. He hated oceanographers, so he says, "You're an oceanographer, and you're going to tell me this." So he answered all the questions. He would say, "I would ask you this, and you're going to say this," and so he smiled at me and says, "You're in the program. Signed to statutory 40 hours a week. You're in the program." And they put me in the closet. I said, "Wait a minute. Rickover says I'm in the program. Why am I in the closet?" And they ran around for a while and they got me out of the closet. I said, I'm done. I'm good. There are all kinds of, yes.
Mentioned as a computer guide feedback, the course. Is that the same thing for something ballast when they go below a certain depth?
Oh, yeah, your bubble collapses.
Let's say document point below which something where the compressed air can't actually force itself to balance the pressure.
Well, for Thresher, it was 4,500 pounds reduced to 3,000. So you're not going to have a problem because your pressure at test depths is about 610. You can argue atmospheric, whatever. So, but it just slows down the blow and your bubble is very small. Pressure could blow, if pressure ballast tanks had worked properly, would have blown out about 10% of reserve buoyancy, which is over 100,000 pounds. But it didn't do that because of icing and other problems. That's where it surfaced. If it didn't have strainers and orifice plates in its blow system.
They didn't have enough good enough dryer system for their expressors.
But that really wasn't the problem. The system was designed, the reducers were designed for that. The system was designed for that, but it was not designed for the Murata installed strainers and orifice plates in there. They were designed because they were eating up reducers madly. I approached Murata, I got a nasty letter from their lawyer saying, don't talk to me.
Bruce, I think, well, there's two more questions.
Yeah, so first
Bruce.
question, thanks for the plug for Submarine, appreciate it. You talk about Nautilus being very noisy.
Yes,
Is that due to her speed or at the same speed that Guppy was running? Was it quite a bit noisier because?
oh yes, because all the machinery was hard mounted to the hulls, all of the pumps. And a submarine is all pumps. We don't have auxiliary steam and stuff. It's all electric pumps. And so that vibration would go out the hull. So it was very noisy. I heard diesel boat guys say we could hear her coming and we could try as much as we could on our battery to get in line to shoot her. We'd be dealing with Mark 37 torpedoes, which are not very long range electric torpedoes. So one more.
Thank you, sir. I was curious, know it's a broad question, maybe if you could condense it down a bit, but overall, given how shocking the loss of pressure was at the time, how, I guess, personally, reflect any personal thoughts over how it sort of impacted the overall culture of the naval submarine service at that time, right after.
Oh, it was a tremendous impact because it was the world's most advanced submarine, and they wanted to get this submarine deployed, and it spent a year doing shakedown crews and exercise with older nuclear submarines, exercise with diesel submarines, and they knew it was hot stuff. They wanted to get where they could find Russian submarines. Of course, they were all above the North Cape. I think the first Russian submarine that came down below the North Cape was in 62 or 63. So they wanted to get deployed, but no, it was a shocker. And because if you read quotes by like Ned Beach and some of these guys, they said that we knew this was dangerous. We knew that going deep and fast was dangerous, and that we didn't have all the stuff together because there was no backup to saving a submarine that was deep and heavy other than nuclear repulsion. If you lost your reactor to a scram, you shut the steam stop. I showed you a main steam stop up there, and your repulsion goes away for at least 20 to 30 minutes. And Thresher had a scram about 7 minutes before it collapsed. So it was a shocker, and there were still guys that wanted to be brave. There were guys who were asking permission on their submarine because they immediately cut a depth limit. One has test depth, and there were submarine CEOs that said we want to go back to 1,300 feet again to show the crew that we're all good. And that was a no. So it initiated the SubSafe program. The SubSafe program is a whole nother. It changed everything. It changed the procedures. It changed the way we dealt with material, how we manufactured it, how we installed it, level of control, because there was very little quality control on Thresher. We could do another lecture on silver braze joints.